At 8:42 on a foggy January evening in 1969, an express train was racing through the English countryside at about 75 to 90 miles per hour. The driver of this express train had already passed one signal telling him to slow down, and he was about to pass another telling him to stop. Hidden somewhere ahead of him in the fog was a slow-moving parcels train, but by the time the driver saw it and applied the brakes, it was far too late. The collision that followed was devastating, and it happened exactly where I'm standing right now. The investigation that followed found something incredibly troubling. Everything seemed to be working fine. In today's video, using the official report, we're going to be finding out exactly what happened, why this driver didn't stop, and why people lost their lives because of it. But we'll also be finding out why this tragic crash also brought out the most heroic side of society. This is the Marden train crash. I'm going to apologise now for the slight lack of dramatic railway shots. It's kind of difficult to get any when I'm essentially at the bottom of an embankment, so you'll have to make do with lots of lovely shots of nature instead. Saturday the 4th of January 1969 was cold and foggy across parts of Kent. On the main railway line between Tunbridge and Ashford, it was reported that visibility varied massively. Some people reported that they could see no further than 25 yards, others reported that they could see about 100 yards, so it was all over the place. And afterwards, the official investigator reported that fog was thick and dense in patches, but at the time, getting heavier between Paddock Wood and Marden. And while that fog was beginning to build up, an 8-coach electric express train was preparing to leave London's Charing Cross for Ramsgate. That train was the 8 p.m. service that was heading towards the Kent coast, and it consisted of 2 4-coach electric multiple units, numbered 7181 and 7117. And that all in all made up about 296 tonnes of train. In charge of the train was driver Harvey, who was 38 years old and very experienced on the railways, who, and this will prove to be key, was also very familiar with this particular route. And that day he booked on at 3:30 p.m. with plenty of time before his train was due to depart. The guard on board was George Mummery, a guard with 47 years of experience, with 17 of those being as a train guard. Mummery had actually already been working the train that day. He'd done the Ramsgate to London service earlier in the day, and when it arrived at Charing Cross at 7:20, he went for a cup of tea. And around 20 minutes later at 7:40, he returned to the locomotive and wandered over to the front of the train. Here he found Harvey, who was busy changing the train's head code. Now, the two men had known each other for years, and when they met, they spent a bit of time, just chatting about the usual stuff, social matters, that kind of thing. And Mummery later recalled that Harvey seemed his usual self. Nothing seemed particularly out of order, although apparently he was recovering from a heavy cold. The report specifically goes on to note that there was no indication that Harvey was in any way unfit to drive that train that day. It's been a while since I had to do this. Most of the videos I've covered recently I've been able to get to relatively easily. Climbing down cliffs hasn't always been the easiest, but this is the first time in a while that I've had to park a long way away from where I need to get to. Because, sometimes when a train crash happens, it doesn't happen in the most accessible location. So what I'm having to do right now is find legitimate ways of getting across fields to exactly where this crash took place. Currently using the tried and tested thinking of a proper rambler, in which I assume the legitimacy of a footpath by how well trodden it is. I don't think that's in the actual Rambler's Guide, so don't quote me on that. Don't come after me, Ramblers. Yes, here we go. That, my friends, is both a tiny countryside bridge and a stile. We are officially on a path. Just before departure, Mummery carried out some tests of the braking systems and everything seemed to be working fine. At which point he returned to the brake compartment and used the train's loudophone to let Harvey know that everything was good and he was set to depart. And that being the case, the train left London Charing Cross at 8 p.m. on the dot. Now, under the normal timetable, Harvey had little reason to expect another train to be immediately ahead of him. The last service before his train was the 7:18 p.m. parcels train from London Bridge to Dover Priory, so having left 42 minutes before should have been of little concern. That parcels train consisted of 8 vans hauled by a Class 33 diesel-electric locomotive, number 6558. According to the timetable, that parcels train should have passed Paddock Wood 20 minutes before the express and ultimately reached Ashford 18 minutes ahead of it. But this was not a normal evening. Ahead of the parcels train was a special train carrying lengths of continuous welded rail. That train consisted of 5 salmon wagons, and yes, that is spelt like the fish. Those wagons were loaded with 300-foot rails, and this train's maximum speed on the open line was only 25 miles per hour. And that train had originally been scheduled to leave Paddock Wood at 6:10 p.m. And here's where things start to go wrong. The driver of that train carrying those rails had refused to take it forward because the fitted head specified in his special traffic notice had not been provided. The locomotive and brake van for that train therefore had to go back to Tunbridge, collect the necessary wagons, and bring them back to Paddock Wood. And by the time that train carrying the rails had finally departed, it was 8:12 p.m. More than 2 hours late. And only 8 minutes later at 8:20, the parcels train passed through Paddock Wood. But now, instead of having a clear railway ahead of it, the parcels service was now following a heavily restricted engineering train through thick fog. And here's where it gets technical. The signalling system between Paddock Wood and Marden had been installed around 1962, and the line was controlled by colour light signals and track circuits. If you don't already know, a track circuit detects a train through the presence of its wheels and axles, meaning that when it detects the presence of a train, the track behind it becomes immediately and automatically more restricted. On this line behind me here, the main signals involved were A322, A324, A370 and A372, and they were spaced roughly 2,000 yards apart. Earlier that evening, track circuit FJ near Marden began falsely showing that the line was occupied, with the first apparent failure happening at around 6:20 p.m. It then seemed to correct itself, but at 7:14, it failed again. Now, because track circuit FJ controlled signal A370, the signal that our parcels train will be waiting at later on, the failure had caused that signal to remain at danger, even when there was no train occupying the section beyond it. So clearly seeing that there was a pretty serious problem here, signal and telecommunications technician P.E. Young was sent from Tunbridge to investigate. Now, track circuit FJ included a set of catch points, and Young had experienced some problems with these before, and when he reached them, he discovered that the first stretcher bar had broken, and that break was producing a short circuit which was falsely indicating that the track was occupied. Now, having dealt with this kind of thing before, Young removed the damaged bar and restored the track circuit at approximately 8:30 p.m. He then walked all the way back to Marden Station, the walk that I will be doing later, and telephoned Ashford's signal box at around 8:40 p.m. to report that the fault had been repaired. Now, that timing is really important. That failure had delayed several trains, including the slow rail train and the parcels train. But by the time the express was passing through Paddock Wood, those signals had been restored, and everything was responding normally to the correct positions of the trains. Back to our parcels train. It left Tunbridge at 8:12 p.m, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. And at Tunbridge, another van had been attached, bringing its total to 8. And as it travelled towards Paddock Wood, the fog became progressively thicker and thicker, and the driver of the parcels train, R. Pocknell, began receiving restrictive signals. The signals at PE 130 and PE 129 at Paddock Wood were initially showing danger, although both changed to a single yellow as the parcels train approached. And because of this, Pocknell passed PE 129 at only around 5 miles per hour, was going pretty slowly at this point. But of course we know that rail carrying train is ahead of him, so as he accelerated towards signal A322 to about 10 miles per hour, he noticed that signal A322 was at danger. So Pocknell stopped, as he should, and his second man was just preparing to climb down and use the signal telephone when the signal automatically changed back to caution. The rail carrying train ahead had moved far enough forward to clear the next relevant section, and so the second man stayed where he was, and the parcels train continued. Just still very slowly. Gonna be honest, it doesn't feel like that many people are coming this way that regularly. Pretty sure this footbridge is alright. Yeah, was never in doubt. When they reached the next signal, A324, they found it was also at danger. So once again, Pocknell brought the parcels train to a stop. And this time, both he and his second man left the locomotive. The second man telephoned Ashford's signal box and was told that there was a rail train ahead and a track circuit failure near Marden, explaining the restrictive signals that they were experiencing. But again, while he was speaking on the phone, signal A324 changed from danger to caution, and the signalman instructed them to then continue to signal A370 and call him again from there. So at this point you've got these two very slow trains kind of hopping forward together from signal to signal very, very slowly. It's slow going and probably, I can imagine, quite frustrating. So they got back in the locomotive and the parcels train carried on to A370 at about 10 miles per hour again. And when Pocknell first saw the signal, it was displaying a caution. But because he'd been instructed to call again, he stopped the train. Again, the second man contacted Ashford and was told that the fault had cleared and that the train could now proceed normally. At this point, probably hoping that this was the last hurdle in what was becoming quite a tiresome journey. So, Pocknell released the brakes and began slowly accelerating. Again, that signal was still at caution, so he could only go so fast. And his train had just about reached somewhere between 10 and 15 miles per hour when all of a sudden, from somewhere behind, there came what he described as a tremendous bang. And timed it quite nicely for this section because I'm finally here. Behind me, admittedly not the easiest to see, there's a section down here without so much heavy bush, as an actress said to a bishop. Here is exactly where this happened, so there is no more appropriate place to finally find out what occurred that night. Meanwhile, the passenger express was travelling perfectly normally. It stopped at Waterloo East and passed through London Bridge on time, no problems at all. And it then began to gain on its schedule, so by the time it reached Sevenoaks, it was 4 minutes early. As they approached Tunbridge, there were several restrictions in place and Harvey reduced the speed of the train correctly, passing through Tunbridge station without incident. And at 8:34 p.m, the express passed Tunbridge approximately 3 minutes early. Then, 5 minutes later, it passed through Paddock Wood. The official report records that time as being approximately 8:39 p.m. At this moment, only a little way ahead, the parcels train was still sitting between signals A324 and A370. Now, Paddock Wood should have been easily recognisable, even in poor visibility, poor weather, bad conditions. It was a notable station. There were platform loops, sidings, and the junction with Maidstone branch. And the investigator concluded that he didn't think there was any way that Harvey could have become what he called geographically lost in the fog. He should have known where he was. We've seen something similar come up with the Elton Wellhall crash, where even with the state the driver was in that particular story, he should have known exactly where he was before everything went wrong. These drivers were very, very familiar with these routes, and to a certain extent, their controlling of the train was, done by instinct, by habit, by just repeating those same routes over and over again. It probably became pretty much automatic function for them. But after passing Paddock Wood Station, the driver now had several important signals ahead of him to pay attention to. The first was A322 and the second was A324. And the third, A370, was the signal just ahead of the parcels train. Now, at the time, under normal clear signals, a train of this type could travel through Paddock Wood at around 80 miles per hour. The route rose and undulated gently towards Marden, but it was a pretty straight line, so you could pick up a decent amount of speed. And so an express train like this one could be expected to pass signal A370 at somewhere between 75 and 80 miles per hour. And that was considered an appropriate speed in clear weather with everything functioning normally. But, as we know, everything on this night was not normal. The parcels train ahead was occupying track circuit FH. The fact that it was sitting there meant that the signals facing the express as it left Paddock Wood could only display one sequence. At Paddock Wood itself, signal PE129 was green. A little further, A322 was at caution, and ahead of that, signal A324 was at danger. A set of signals clearly indicating to any approaching train that they needed to slow down and stop because there was something ahead of them. A green signal told a driver that the next signal would either be green or yellow. A322's caution or yellow signal warned him that the next signal was going to be red. And so by the time Harvey reached A324's red danger signal, he had to stop. But he didn't. The express continued at full speed. Meanwhile, over in the Ashford signal box, the signalman was watching the train's progress through the track circuit indications on his panel. Watching his panel, he saw the express pass Paddock Wood and occupy track circuits FF and FG, and he could see ahead of it that track circuit FH was still occupied by the parcels train. When the express cleared FG, while FH was still occupied, the signalman knew what was about to happen. Had that horrible realization that a collision was now unavoidable. Doing all he realistically could, he sent the obstruction danger bell signal to Tunbridge, and then he waited. It was 8:42 p.m. Now, in this thick, patchy fog, Harvey may not have been able to see each signal until he was only around 150 yards away. Given the reports of the conditions at the time, it's probably the max we can assume he would have been able to see a signal from. And travelling at 75 to 80 miles per hour, that meant that each signal may have only been visible to him for no more than 4 or 5 seconds before the train passed it by. The official investigator could find no explanation for what was about to happen other than that Harvey had just somehow failed to observe both A322 at caution and A324 at danger. And ultimately, the reason would never be established. The investigation could, however, rule out certain things. They knew that Harvey had not fallen asleep because he was holding down the driver's safety device. The cab controls essentially required continuous pressure from the driver, and if Harvey had released the device while the reverser remained in the forward position, the brakes would have been applied automatically. And the report, quite chillingly, simply concluded that once the train had passed Paddock Wood under those clear signals, Harvey, being super familiar with the route, knowing what the schedule should be usually, he may have just relaxed. May have just taken his eye off the ball a certain amount and was
possibly just running on autopilot. And believing the line ahead to be clear, as it normally would be, he became what the report calls abstracted and failed to notice the two signals in the thickening fog.
The tragic thing, another tragic layer to this is that just before the collision took place, something clearly attracted Harvey's attention back to the line in front of him. He may have actually seen signal A370 finally appearing through the fog. Could have also been the red tail lamp on the parcels train ahead of him. We will never know, and the official report couldn't work out what it would have been. But all we do know is that Harvey finally reacted.
Hauntingly, the surviving brake handle, when it was found, was in the full emergency position. And the train's brake equipment was later tested, and not a single defect was discovered. From some of the passenger accounts we have, which were varied, and they often are after a traumatic event like this, people's recollections seem to kind of get a bit muddled, which is perfectly understandable. But collectively overall, it suggested that some of the passengers noticed that the brakes may have been applied around 3 or 4 seconds before impact. Guard Mummery also said afterwards that he felt what he believed was a full emergency application or a release of the driver's safety device shortly before the crash. And from the report's reconstruction, it was calculated that with this information and what we knew after the crash, it seemed that Harvey must have seen signal A370 at caution from around 150 yards away. As we were saying, that was probably his max distance in these conditions. And having seen that at caution, he had shut off power and begun braking. And remember, signal A370, which had been stopping that parcels train, had just been turned back to caution, which is why that parcels train was slowly beginning to pull away now. And having seen this from a distance, Harvey must have shut off power and began braking. Then it's highly likely that he next saw the tail lamp of the parcels train, at which point he must have pushed the brake handle fully forward, releasing the driver's safety device at the same time, and possibly may have attempted to leap from the cab of the train. But at this point, the express train was still travelling at approximately 75 to 80 miles per hour. Obviously, a train on tracks carrying a lot of weight doesn't just brake. It takes time and distance. And in this case, there was nowhere near enough of either. The express train struck the rear of the parcels train at 8:42 p.m. At the moment of impact, the parcels train was moving at around 10 to 15 miles per hour, making the difference in speed between the two about 65 or 70 miles per hour. The impact propelled the locomotive and the undamaged front portion of the parcels train forwards. Later, driver Pocknell estimated that his locomotive was thrown ahead by around 2 engine lengths. But of course, they were at the OK end of the train. At the rear, the destruction was almost total. The final 3 vans, despite their steel construction, and we talk a lot about how these, modern at the time steel constructed carriages and vans were a lot better at holding up to impact. But in this case, they were effectively demolished. One van came to rest across both railway tracks, that's the up and down lines. It was driven into the ground at one end with incredible force, while its other end was forced approximately 15 feet into the air. And parts of the body of this van were later found beneath the leading coach of the express. Another van was thrown down the embankment. The vehicles at the front of the parcels train actually remained on the rails and had essentially been protected, cushioned from impact by the incredible destruction behind them. The leading coach of the passenger train left the rails and plunged down the 5-foot embankment. It then rolled over and continued its forward momentum, but now upside down. Its bodywork through all of this being completely demolished. It finally came to a stop at the foot of the embankment, about 115 to 120 yards beyond the point of impact, with its underframe lying, of course, upside down, forming a sort of roof over what was now just wreckage beneath it. The second coach overrode the first, came to a rest on its side, partly ahead of the leading coach, with one side completely torn open and severe damage to its leading end. The third coach then jackknifed between the second and fourth. One end was dragged down the bank, while the other remained near the track. The final 5 coaches remained upright and broadly in a line, although they had been derailed towards the upline. Now, we mentioned that van that had been thrown across both lines, the up and down. Now, this was obviously hugely dangerous to anything coming in the opposite direction. And the collision had short-circuited both conductor rails, which, as it was supposed to, and caused the traction current circuit breakers to trip, which of course should have automatically changed the signals further down the line to caution and danger, because it would have been able to tell that there was something wrong, there was something there blocking the track. But it didn't work. Even with that wreckage completely blocking the upline, it didn't operate the corresponding track circuit. And the automatic signal that should have been protecting other trains from this obstruction, signal A321, continued to display green. Seeing the danger of this, the parcels train crew immediately began trying to do what they could to protect both lines. Driver Pocknell sent his second man towards Marden. He then gathered detonators and placed them on the upline by signal A321. Detonators, as we've covered in other crashes like this, were there in place of signals and often used in foggy conditions like this, and are essentially small explosives that when a train went over would alert them to the fact that they needed to slow down and stop right away. Pocknell then telephoned the Tunbridge signalman, letting them know that A321 was still showing green. Whilst he was doing this, the train guard from the parcels train, A.G. Keane, ran back towards the wreckage behind them. It was here that he met George Mummery, the guard from the express. They together agreed that they'd done what they could to secure the upline coming towards them, and they agreed that Mummery would go to the back of the express train and do what he could to protect them there. Keane then ran as fast as he could to the electrical substation near Marden and used a telephone there. At 8:58 p.m, he asked the electrical controller to summon the emergency services and confirmed that the traction current had been switched off. Mummery also made his way to signal A370 and used the telephone there to report the collision to Ashford. On his trip there, he estimated that the signal could only be seen from about 25 yards away and that it was showing green. He then made his way back to signal A324, which was at danger as it had been, and placed 3 detonators there.
Now, as we can tell from being here, this site is remote. And obviously that evening it didn't really look like this. It had been recently ploughed, so these fields were rough and muddy. And it was dark. It was almost 9 o'clock at night, so visibility wasn't great either. And there's no lighting obviously here at all. So for the emergency services, this all of a sudden became a really difficult place to get to. And that is shown by the response times that night. And the first ambulance didn't even arrive until 9:06. That's 24 minutes after the accident took place. And even then, it rocked up at Marden Station, not here. And the inquiry afterwards did find that some of that delay was avoidable. It was difficult to get here, but not that difficult. What they used at the time to help locate locations along the track was they used the automatic signal locations, and they were listed on a map so that if an accident like this occurred, then somebody could say, oh, well, somebody could get in touch with the authorities and be like, it happened close to signal A320, something like that, and they'd be able to pinpoint it on the map. But that list was out of date. Signal A370 was still listed under its original designation of RE23. That was back from before the Marden signal box had closed. And so when the crash was reported, and it was reported as having happened near signal A370, they couldn't find it. It didn't exist. And that delay in working out that everything was outdated and they were just going to have to find it themselves cost the emergency responses 10 minutes. It was also noted by the investigator that the ambulances could have been called earlier. They could have been called by the signalman when he knew that the collision was going to take place, and that they shouldn't have waited to know the exact location before contacting the police as well. And here is where we get to the incredible story of the rescue efforts for the people trapped in this wrecked train. Because of this remoteness and because it took the emergency services so long to get here, and they weren't really suited to travelling through a ploughed field, several local heroes stepped up to the plate and joined the recovery efforts. And who better but to traverse this kind of landscape than the local farmers? Local farmer Mr. David Winch and his team came here and did whatever they could, bringing all the equipment that they had to help in any way. The ambulances couldn't get here, so they brought tractors and trailers to carry the wounded and shocked across the fields to the waiting ambulances. And they worked through the night. All in all, they spent 14 hours here. And without them and their incredible efforts, many, many, many more people could have found themselves in pretty dire circumstances. And ultimately, the fatality list from this crash could have been far, far worse.
Incredibly, 3 people who found themselves also part of the rescue teams here were 3 local teenagers. They had supposedly heard the crash and gone to Marden Station to tell whoever they could. Now, of course, having not heard anything or had any reports from anyone, the clerk on duty just didn't believe them. So instead they went to the local fire station, and that's where they found that fire engines had already been called out to a train crash. Then, running as fast as they could back to that railway station, the clerk had now been told what had happened, and clearly seeing 3 very willing volunteers in front of him, told them that they could go down and see if there was any assistance that they could offer. And when they reached the scene of the crash, they made themselves very useful by helping to escort survivors to those tractors and trailers where they could then be taken to hospital. Apparently then they later made it home to very concerned parents. Eventually, 18 ambulances and 10 fire engines arrived. And together with the farmers through those narrow lanes, they managed to establish some vehicle access across 2 of those recently ploughed fields. The local Women's Royal Voluntary Service also established a field kitchen and supplied rescuers with food and hot drinks. Then, Kent Constabulary, the fire service, the ambulance service, and those farmers started work in extremely difficult conditions. Remember, it was muddy, dark, and foggy. These were far from ideal rescue and recovery conditions.
The last injured person was removed from the wreckage at 11:37 p.m, but the final body wasn't recovered until 8:55 a.m. the following morning. All in all, there were over 100 passengers on that express train, and when the collision took place, 4 people lost their lives, including driver Harvey. 11 other passengers were taken to hospital, where 9 of them were detained with serious injuries. And of course, many, many others suffered minor injuries. Now, of course, the first thing you look to when a crash like this happens is the system in place to prevent something like this happening, that being the signalling system. So that's where they looked first. Add that to the track circuit failure that had just happened, and you can understand why the suspicions fell there. One signal had been held at danger for more than an hour, and the collision had happened in heavy fog where trains could travel up to 90 miles per hour.
The signalling equipment was subjected to extensive testing. They looked at the signals, the track circuits, the relays, cables, and the complete aspect sequences. Some cable insulation readings were below the preferred standard, but the investigators accepted that these could not have produced a dangerous or wrong side signalling failure. The tests they did demonstrated that when the parcels train stopped, occupying track circuit FH, signal A324 would be at danger and A322 would be at caution. They therefore concluded that the signalling was operating correctly at the time of the accident. That earlier failure of track circuit FJ had been real, and it had delayed the parcels train. But its effect had been to hold signal A370 at danger. And once that broken stretcher bar was removed, it returned to normal operation. And it was found that the technicians' work could not have affected signal A324 or the track circuit that controlled that signal.
The track circuit failure helped explain the unusual traffic pattern that was going on that night, but what that didn't do was display a false green signal to the Express. Everything was working just before this happened, and so the Express should have encountered a yellow signal at A322 and a red signal at A324. And the investigation was perfectly happy that those two signals were displaying correctly at the time.
Now, when the rescue parties finally arrived on the site, driver Harvey's body was found approximately 12 feet behind the driving position. He was actually found inside what had been the first passenger compartment. And to investigators, this raised a disturbing possibility. Had driver Harvey deliberately left the cab while the train was still moving? Theoretically, the controls could have been arranged so that the train continued to coast without the driver needing to hold down the safety device. So, in order to confirm this, investigators carried out a practical test. They brought a similar train that reached Paddock Wood at 79 miles per hour. Its power was then shut off and it was allowed to coast. By around signal A322, its speed fell to 75 miles per hour. By A324, it was at 65 miles per hour, and by the time it reached A370, it was just a little under 60 miles per hour. And that reduction in speed would have been very obvious to the guard and passengers aboard. And it would also, of course, have produced a much lower impact speed than the destruction indicated. And so this theory was rejected, and it was concluded that Harvey had remained in his cab and that his body had simply been thrown backwards during the violent destruction of the leading coach. Now, although the signals had been working, this particular line was not equipped with the automatic warning system. We've covered this before. AWS provides a driver with an audible indication inside the cab, and when approaching a restrictive signal, a horn sounds. The driver needs to acknowledge that horn, and if they do not, the train's brakes are automatically applied. The investigation believed that if AWS had been involved here, it would have prevented this collision. Harvey would have received a warning around 200 yards before signal A322 and another 200 yards before A324. Had he then failed to respond to either of those warnings, the brakes would have automatically gone on. Another practical test was done using a similar train travelling at the same speed. An AWS inductor placed 194 yards before signal A324 brought the test train to a stand more than 1,000 yards before signal A370. Well clear of where the parcels train was when it had been struck.
Now, AWS is fantastic, and of course we've covered more than enough accidents that would have been prevented if AWS had been present on those trains and those tracks. But of course, having AWS in his cab would not have removed Harvey's responsibility to be looking out for those signals. It's just an additional defence to try and cover for that human error. But of course, here between Paddock Wood and Marden, that defence was nowhere to be seen.
What makes this even more frustrating is that AWS was actually installed in the cab of Harvey's train. It had been installed there for testing of the system, it just wasn't on the line yet. Ultimately, the official inquiry found no defect in the express train's brakes. There was no evidence at all to show that Harvey was drunk or medically unfit or suffering from poor eyesight. There was no evidence that he'd abandoned his controls. That track circuit failure from earlier had been repaired correctly, and the signalling tests established that both signal A322 and A324 were correctly displaying caution and danger. Yet the express had still passed both signals at high speed. The report concluded, or as it couldn't definitively say, but it believed that Harvey had simply relaxed after passing Paddock Wood under green signals and become either distracted by something or simply become mentally abstracted. He wasn't with it. And it was only when A370 at caution appeared through the fog that he reacted. He applied the emergency brakes immediately, but the parcels train was already right there.
The official report placed responsibility for this crash entirely upon driver Harvey. But what it couldn't explain was what it was that had distracted him. It was just a case of one experienced driver missing two incredibly important signals, followed by a few seconds of desperate braking. 4 people died here, and so many more had their lives completely changed by this. And it all could have been prevented by a system that did exist at the time. This tragedy, this story, becomes more than just one man's inexplicable failure. It becomes about a railway that was still relying on one pair of human eyes when there were other fail-safes around that they could have taken advantage of and should have years before. As always with any train crash, any disaster, transport disaster, something like this, it's often a case that after the investigation concludes, it's so clear that they could have all been very, very preventable. Well, from here between Paddock Wood and Marden, thank you for watching today. As always, if you have any other suggestions for events similar to this, or any interesting local story that you have, I am keen to branch out and look at as many different interesting historical stories as I possibly can, because there are so many interesting stories out there, and that's what we're trying to find on this channel. So thank you for all your support as always. Like and subscribe, all of that helps get these stories out to so many more people and helps the memory of the people who are lost in awful tragedies like this continue in some fashion. Obviously, it's most important to remember those that were lost and affected by this. So on that note, I've got a very long walk ahead of me, so I'll see you in the next one.